Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Roxanne and I am the Senior HR Advisor in iTeam. So today's webinar is number 2 in a series of 4 HR webinars we are delivering through November. So please do look out for our remaining sessions that we have coming up. Today's webinar is all about contracts of employment. Just so you know, a recorded version of this webinar will also be available and a link will go out to everyone that has signed up. So just a little bit about the webinar system itself, if you're not familiar with Big Marker. You will see on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a Q&A tab as well as a polls tab. Please add your questions as we go through the webinar, and if I can't answer them as we go along, I will answer them at the end of the webinar. There's also going to be a few poll questions in this webinar. So when I mention poll, if you click on the poll tab, you'll be able to answer the questions I am asking. And just so you know as well, I am working the poll tabs, the question tabs, as well as delivering the presentation and flicking through the slides as well. So if you see me kind of going from one screen to the other, that's why. So talking of polls, just before we go into the main session, I'd like to ask some questions just to understand today's audience a bit better. So if you can go and if you can have a look at your polls tab, I will put a couple of questions out there to you. So the first one being, is asking, is your practice NHS private or mixed? And then the second poll question is just to get an understanding of how many people are in your team. So I'm going to launch that one as well. Great, so the results are coming in, so let's have a look. Okay, great. So it looks like the majority are mixed practices at the moment, but we've got others from just NHS and private as well, so that's great. And then in terms of numbers of people in your team, okay, so the majority of 15 plus, but then a good spread on some of the smaller practice and middle-sized practices as well. So that's really good. That's just really interesting for us to know. So thank you so much for doing that. If you haven't answered the polls, then you can answer them as we go through the presentation. So let's get started. So in the session today, I'm going to cover contract fundamentals. We're also going to cover which contract you should use from our implied templates. And then we're going to have a look at the Agilio contract review service. So what this is and how you can make use of it. So starting off with contract fundamentals, there are 5 stages that you need to go through when forming a contract for the contract to be enforceable in law. There needs to be an offer where one party makes an offer. Typically, this is the practice offering employment or a contract of services for a self-employed worker. This is usually where a conditional offer is made, verbally or in writing. You then have acceptance. So this is where the other party accepts the offer, and this is usually a verbal acceptance. A really important stage, which I think some people will not even give much thought to, but is consideration. So each party provides consideration to the other. Consideration can be a promise to pay money or a promise to do something. So in summary, each party receives a benefit from signing the contract. You then have to have the intention to be legally bound. So both parties have an intention to be legally bound by the agreement, which is proposed by the offer and then accepted. Then when do you issue that contract? So legislation changed in April 2020, and under Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act 1996, all new employees and workers are entitled to receive basic information in writing on or before they start work. This is sometimes referred to as a Section 1 statement or contract. Failing to provide the Section 1 statement can lead to an employment tribunal award of up to £2,100. So it just makes really good sense to make sure that that is done either on the day that the person starts work or before. Okay, so what needs to be in the statement of terms and conditions? So we've just covered how you form a contract, but what information actually needs to be in the contract. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, legislation changed in April 2020 to say that every worker has the right to receive written terms of employment. Written terms of employment includes information such as pay and working hours. This document is often referred to as the employment contract, but by law, the employment contract is broader than just these written terms, and I'll explain more about this shortly. So the text on this slide in white is the minimum basic information you should include when drafting a contract. The text in yellow are examples of what else can be included, but isn't a necessity, and your handbook would usually capture this. To make things easier for you, you'll be pleased to know that our iComply templates have more than the minimum information required. So I'm going to talk a little bit about express and implied terms. So a contract will contain specific terms agreed in writing, which are called express terms. Examples of express terms are things like the job title, the rate of pay and how often the employee will be paid, the hours of work, holidays and any holiday pay, sick pay, pensions, and any collective agreements which directly affect the terms and conditions of employment. So those are called your express terms. You then have terms that are too obvious to be written expressly in the contract, which are called implied terms. So implied terms are either imposed by common law, i.e. a judge-made law, or are statutory, i.e. laws made by Parliament. They are deemed to be included in every contract of employment, whether the employee or employer intended them to be. So examples of employed terms are mutual trust and confidence, things like not disclosing any trade secrets and keeping confidentiality, to obey reasonable and lawful orders, to take care of the employee's equipment, and the standards of behaviour that you expect. For example, if you've got customer-facing roles, you expect them to be polite. So although it's not written in the contract, you expect that to happen. And you should also have in there what happens if these are not met. For example, if you're investigating a theft and you found that somebody had been stealing something, then it's putting on there that you will have the right to report any thefts to the police. Should also make sure that all contracts should meet statutory terms. So what we mean by that is just say you state in a contract that somebody's going to be paid I don't know, £4 an hour, then this would be against law because it's below the minimum wage. So you need to ensure that all contracts meet the statutory terms. Express and implied terms form the basis of every contract of employment or services and are essentially the rights and duties of both employers and employees or workers. Okay, so we've covered then what forms a contract and what should be included in a contract. So we're just now going to have a look at how you would make a change or a variation to a contract. But just before we do this, I have another poll question. So if you can have a look at your poll tab, and then it's just asking about whether you've ever had to take an employee or employees through a consultation process when proposing a change to terms and conditions. Okay, so it's fairly even split on this one. So so for those of you that haven't, okay, actually, so no has just taken over. So hopefully for those that haven't taken anybody through a consultation, this slide will be helpful for you. So we're going to start off by looking at employee team members. So when you want to propose a change to the contract, the first thing you need to do is check if the contract allows you to make this variation and if there is a good or legitimate reason to do so. Most contracts will have a variation clause, and the iComply templates do have this variation clause. If there are minor changes to be made, you can notify employees in writing, and the changes will take effect from the date of the notice or other date as specified. Greater changes can only be made after consultation, and you will need to provide appropriate notice. So after checking that you have the variation clause that allows you to make a change, you'll need to follow the process on this slide. So the first thing you need to do is consult. So this basically means meeting with the individuals, giving them the opportunity for them to suggest alternatives to what you're proposing. The consultation allows you to consider the impact this change will have on them and let the individual think about what impact this change will have for them. It's then important for you to review the impacts and the considerations that have been put forward and meet again to discuss these with the employee. In a perfect world, the employee agrees to these changes and then you implement the change. Once this is done, you can then issue a subsequent changes to terms and conditions letter, which you'll find in iComply. The code is just there, M245B-CTC. There are additional steps to follow if an individual doesn't agree with the new terms, and we can help you navigate this if this happens. But in summary, if you found yourself in this situation and you've considered the impact that this change would have, you would have to dismiss the employee and then immediately re-engage them on new terms and conditions. So this process does very rarely happen, because you'll find that most employees will agree to new terms and conditions. But if you do find yourself in that situation where you've proposed new terms and conditions and the employee doesn't agree with them, then please speak to us about that, and we can navigate you through this, because it's a slightly more longer, complex process. So we can talk you through that. So we're now going to look at self-employed agreements. So when you're considering making amendments to a self-employed agreement, these are usually more straightforward than what you need to go through when considering making changes to an employed team member's terms and conditions. First of all, again, you'll need to check that there is a variation clause within that contract. So our contracts in iComply do have this variation clause, but if you're not using one of our contracts, then you'll need to get the workers agreement to actually add that variation clause in there, which would then allow you to go on and suggest variations. So let's just assume that you've checked that the variation clause is there. Are you using one of our contracts and it's in there? So you go ahead, so you can then go ahead and discuss the proposed changes with the individual and follow up in writing. What you'll tend to find with the self-employed agreements is that there might be some negotiation. So you then, have various conversations with that person around, any negotiations there are to be had. You would then come to an agreement and give notice of the change. And you would then confirm the changes in writing. So currently there isn't a template in iComply for this, but that we do have one which we are in the process of getting uploaded. So we'll notify you of this. So there is a document template for you to use in this scenario. So what if the new terms are not agreeable? So before you propose the change, you will have an idea of how they will land, because you will know whether the new terms that you're proposing are either more favourable or less favourable. So you need to be prepared that if the new terms proposed are less favourable, then an outcome to this could be that the worker doesn't agree to the new terms and conditions. And if you cannot come to an agreement that works for both parties, then the worker may decide to that's not going to work for them, and they may decide to leave. So therefore they may serve notice. So one thing to be aware of is, when you are proposing these new changes for self-employed agreements, is if it's considerably less favourable than their current terms, then you need to be prepared that actually that person may leave. So you need to start planning for that as well. So it's just to be aware of that in case they don't agree to the new terms. Okay, so we're now going to move on and looking at which templates in iComply you should use. So we do get some queries about this. So apologies to those who already know which templates to use. But for those who don't, hopefully you'll find this slide helpful. So these are just some of the self-employed agreements that we've got in iComply, and some of the main ones that we use. So starting off with the provider performer agreement. So this is to use for self-employed dentists working in an NHS practice or a mix of NHS and private. You then have the associate agreement for private practice for self-employed dentists who are working in a private practice. We've then got our hygienist/therapist agreement. This one's for the hourly rate, and then we've then got the same one, which is based on the fee per item. Another contract that is getting a bit more popular is the aesthetic treatment amendments to agreement. So if your performer carries out facial aesthetic treatment, for example, Botox or anti-wrinkle, then this can be used to agree terms of payment. We've then got the locums agreement for private and NHS treatment, contract for cleaning services, assistant dentist, ortho provider, and then another popular one is the license agreement to occupy a treatment room. So those are some of the most popular self-employed agreements in iComply. So then looking at the team members, employed team members contracts. So these templates are usually for nurses and non-clinical team members. So the main contract used here is the staff terms and conditions of employment. So M245A, and there's also a 0 hours version of this as well. We then have the trainee dental nurse contract, which is different to the apprenticeship dental nurse. The trainee dental nurse is entitled to the national minimum wage, and this type of contract is permanent, with an expectation that they will move into a nurse role after successful completion of their training. In this contract, there is a clause which needs to be included when drafting, which refers to the obligations whilst training. It includes things like who's going to be paying for the training, any exam resits. So that clause is already in the implied template, and you just need to make sure that you, draft that for the circumstances. We then have the apprenticeship dental nurse contract, and this is for those who are on a recognised apprenticeship programme, and you'll be required to pay them the national minimum wage for apprenticeships, which is different to the national minimum wage. The main difference from an employment perspective between a trainee and an apprenticeship is the type of contract and wage. With an apprenticeship, the contract ends on successful completion of the apprenticeship, and the employer is not obligated to employ them as a nurse, although you can do so if you choose. We've then got a couple of, or we've got a few contracts here then, which we do have on iComply. They're not used that often, but there are some practices where some of these roles could be employed. So usually your hygienist, therapist and performer would be self-employed, but there are examples of when these roles will be employed. So we've got contracts for that as well. So just moving on then to look at contract storage. So there's no issue with storing contracts or documents in hard or paper copies. The key is making sure that you have the information on file. However, we are speaking to a lot of practices who are moving away from traditional paper files for security purposes, but also to save space. It is also a tool to make life easier for practice managers, as this type of information we hear you spend a lot of time chasing team members for. So for our IT members, documents obtained in accordance with the staff file checklist can be uploaded to IT and stored electronically in the application. It's a cloud-based system with password protection to increase the security of the documents, and it makes it a lot easier for you to access information. For example, if you had a CQZ visit and they ask you to evidence this type of information, it makes it a lot easier for you to just go on and access that. There's also a functionality built into IT which allows you to set reminders for when documents are due to expire. So things like GDC registration certificates or indemnity certificates. So it's a really handy tool there. Within iTeam as well, they've got functionality and in iComply actually for documents to be sent to team members with read acceptance functionality. So you know which team members have read the documents or have yet to read the documents. So I mean, we spoke a little bit there about how iTeam can help you. The most important thing to take away from this is that is having the documents and storing it somewhere safe. Whether that be in an electronic system, in a paper file, or in an iTeam application like this. Okay, so a Gilio contract review service. So what is this? How can you benefit that? So the iComply contract templates that you have access to have been drafted by employment solicitors, and they contain all the information you require, which is for you to contain all the information required to satisfy legislation. So this means that for the majority of situations, when you need to issue a contract to an employer or worker, the required template is there for you to use in iComply. It's then easy for you to just go in and add the relevant details for that person. When drafting a new contract, if you're unsure of anything, then send the contract to us and we are more than happy to review this for you before you issue to an individual. And we would say as well that if you think that you need to tweak or amend any of the clauses, because sometimes you will have employees or workers that will say that they've reviewed the contract and actually they want to suggest some amendments, then we would ask you to get in touch with us, because as we said, they are designed by solicitors, and all of the clauses are very important. So if there's any that you want to amend, then please get in touch with us and we can talk you through what the impact might be if you do decide to amend any of these clauses. And we would always say that if in doubt, then just pick up the phone and speak to us. So we're just going to have a look at some of the potential risks to be aware of when it comes to dealing with contracts of employment or services. So making sure that you issue contract on day one or before is really important, because otherwise, if you didn't do this, it could lead to an ETA award of over £2,000, and nobody wants that. So if you're not using the I comply templates, you need to ensure that the contract has all of the minimum required information. Failing to update agreements. So employment law and legislation does change fairly frequently, and agreements will need to be reviewed regularly to ensure that they are fit for purpose and take into consideration any relevant changes. Lucky for you, this is one less thing for you to have to worry about, because we do this anyway as part of our service. This is something that we're always reviewing and monitoring and updating. So if you're using the I comply templates, they are always going to be up to date with the relevant employment law and legislation. So one less thing for you to have to worry about. And then just recapping on why consideration is so important. So if you remember back to some of the first slides that we went through, when forming a contract, it's important that consideration takes place. So just to remind you of what consideration again is, it's the value brought by both parties signing the contract, i.e. payment in exchange for work. So an easy way to think about consideration is that it gives people a reason to want to sign the agreement. So what's in it for them? However, if you allow an employee to start working at the company without signing the agreement first, which does happen quite a lot, then that consideration is gone. So it is a fairly common issue. And while it can be rectified by providing some other incentive to get that person to sign the agreement, it's best practice to make sure you handle all paperwork before the employment commences, including signing the contract. So just a few potential actions to think about then coming out of this session. So review your existing contract. Has anything changed where a subsequent changes to terms and conditions document should be issued to capture this? Ensure you are using the correct version. So we are in the process at the moment of releasing some document changes this week. But don't worry, if we think you need to update any existing documents, then we will let you know. Otherwise, it's fine for you to just keep using the documents as you are now, and then only using the new ones as and when you need them. So the location of employment contracts. Have you saved employee and team members' contracts in a suitable location? And then I think it's really important about that day one requirement. So reminding line managers about needing a contract in place from day one of employment and the impacts of not having it in place. And then this is just a consideration really around consider investing in software to increase efficiency and reduce stress. So you all have access to I comply, but for those of you who don't have iTeam access, it's worth considering a demo to see how iTeam can help take the stress out of managing your team and their HR documents. So those who are not IT members, this is just this is a screen here. It just shows you one of the front pages of the system. So just a quick summary on what it can do to help. You can see on this slide here, it's highlighted 198 missing compulsory documents. So this highlights for the practice manager or the manager looking at this that actually there's 198 missing compulsory documents here. We need to do something about that, and they can be managed in the HR Docs tab. You have the team tab, which has all of your employee personnel information on it, so it's all in one place. It's really handy. And then you've got your leave tab to view and manage the team's annual leave. It's got a really great rota tool as well as time and attendance. I mean, there's so much more that you can do with iTeam that I can tell you in this short webinar. So if you don't already use iTeam and you think it's something that could help you manage your team easier, then please do get in touch with us and book a demo and we can talk you through that.